welcome everybody to saying adios to white Jesus. How y'all doing? We're gonna have fun. There's a ton to go over. I'm pretty sure we will not be able to cover it all, but I'm excited nonetheless. So, the question is, which one of those guys looks like Jesus? Because almost all of those, in various capacities, almost all of them have been portrayals of Jesus. You guys know which one that is? That's the Mormon Jesus. You guys didn't catch that? That's the Mormon Jesus. Should be know right away. Which one's right? By the way, if you look at Mormon paintings, they got Joseph Smith, and he looks. They have him wearing similar color scheme as Jesus in their paintings. So what we're going to talk about is what Jesus Christ didn't look like, and a little bit of what he did look like. But the answer is not as simple as you might think. Let's start off with an important tale, something that happened in history that I think is indicative and important. Does anyone know what church or what city this stained glass window was at one time? Well, that was at 16th Street Baptist in Birmingham. Does anyone know what happened there on a Sunday morning a long time ago?
4 girls got blown up, right?
Yep. It's KKK guys decided dynamite in the bottom of the church would be a good idea. You have 4 little girls getting ready to sing in the choir, and boom, 4 little girls died, and a bunch of people were injured. There's something that even a lot of sort of white Americans who are indifferent to a lot of what was going on said, you know what, I don't think that's exactly right. So it was a tragedy, but it was also a wake-up call. And I mean, think about a person who would do such a thing. Now, it's horrible, but you know what's interesting? In the Middle East today, church bombings, and especially in places in North Africa, on Sunday mornings, they're more than a yearly occurrence still today in 2019. And they're so commonplace that they're not even always reported. And what the Muslims usually do is around Christmas. It's usually when they go off. And just look up Christmas bombings in Nigeria. You'll be shocked. And it's usually in the 30s. One happened just last week. And you'll be like, oh, wow, it's pretty bad. And sometimes you can find the pictures of the aftermath. So this kind of thing still happens. Well, the white Jesus there in Birmingham suffered from the explosion. Ironically, his face got blown off. The face of white Jesus, out of all the things in the stained glass window, was blown off. So they had to replace it. Now this is where the story has a little bit of a note of hope here. Some people in Wales, you know, the Welsh. You guys know who Tom Jones is? He's Welsh. By the way, a lot of Hebrews claim Tom Jones was black.
There's people that you swear are white today that are black. For example, a famous singer looks like a white man.
No, not that.
Dances like a black man. Sings like a black man. But he looks like a white man. But he's a black man.
Who?
Tom Jones.
Tom Jones.
That's right.
So anyways, the people of Wales heard about this, and they had some master craftsmen there. And so this became a international project, and they shipped, they ended up shipping a replacement where the image was in Birmingham Baptist. In the 60s, they replaced it. On the bottom there has the passage that they were going to preach from that Sunday morning, which is whatever you do to the least of these, you've done unto me. You can see a little bit of it there on the bottom. So that's interesting. So he got replaced. So let's talk a little bit about the concept of white Jesus. But I think a great way to do it is by showing a famous scene, at least it's famous to me, from a Malcolm X movie, where he's talking to a chaplain.
You were discussing the disciples. What color were they?
Well, I don't think we know that for certain.
But they were Hebrews, were they not?
That's right.
As was Jesus. Jesus was also a Hebrew.
Why don't you just ask your question?
Yeah, Malcolm X, when he's in prison there. And he's questioning. And of course, in the scene, they place a lot of white Jesus images. There's one in the background you can see. And he's saying, hey, what color is Jesus? And to get there, he's saying, what color are the Hebrews? And the guy rightly answers, in essence, we don't really know. But when he says, well, then you can't know if he's white for sure. And now the guy, that's where he decides to act. He's going to come out from behind the podium, and he's going to have a miniature debate.
I have told you that we don't know that for certain.
Then you can't believe for certain that Jesus was white.
Just a moment. God is white. Isn't it obvious?
Now, did this encounter exactly happen? I don't know. But even if you're saying God is white, so who took flesh, right? The Son. It's not even being really orthodox there, because if you're saying triune God, the Holy Spirit never took flesh. You know, God the Father never took flesh. But he's saying basically, hey, Jesus is white. Look at the picture. I like the response.
But we don't know if it's obvious that God is white. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us that Jesus did not have blonde hair and blue eyes.
So here's the problem. He has a legitimate critique mixed with falsehood. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad, in fact, Malcolm X found out later in his life, is not a good source of information for anything. In fact, one of his books, he talks the way Moses went through some of the mountains that they were having to go through there in the wilderness was by using TNT dynamite. This is in his book. I think that's what we call an anachronism. This is what alternative urban spiritualities do. They have a legitimate critique of sort of a culturalized Christianity, but then they replace it with a bad answer. That's some of the power sort of these types of religions.
Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us that the images of Jesus that are on prison walls and churches throughout the world are not historically correct, because history teaches us that Jesus was born in a region where the people had color. There's proof in the very Bible that you ask us to read in Revelation's 1st chapter, verse 14 and 15.
Well, let's go there. We're going to have to do it quick. Yeah, exactly. So again, replacing with a bad answer is not the solution. Let me read Revelation 1 real quick, what he's referring to. The hairs of his head were white like wool, as white as snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace, and his voice was like the roar of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars. From his mouth came a sharp two-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. So let's break this down. John is receiving a revelation from Jesus. This is the ascended Jesus. So this is what you might call, for lack of a better word, the heavenly Jesus. It's not a picture of Jesus on the earth, right? Jesus didn't walk around this way, did he? In fact, Jesus could be lost in a crowd of Jews, couldn't he? Why do you think Judas had to kiss Jesus to identify him? They didn't have pictures, you know. So it's a way to identify Jesus. If Jesus was walking around like he's portrayed in some of the movies or here, it'd be like, just look for the glowing guy, right? One time, the curtain is peeled back at the Mount of Transfiguration. But that shocked the disciples. That wasn't their everyday Jesus. That was just a taste, and Peter started just rambling about it, right? So what is going on in Revelation 1? It's all context. So let's see what's happening. The hairs of his head, so, were white like wool. What people do who want to make Jesus black is they say, who has woolly hair? The so-called black man. That's how the Hebrew Israelites would put it. But is it saying Jesus' hair texture is like wool? It's not. It's saying the color is white like wool. That's what it's saying. As white as snow. And in fact, his face is shining. So what is that? What color would that be if we're going to make it literal? His eyes were like a flame of fire. So reddened eyes. Some of the more crass, for example, Hebrew Israelites will say, yeah, haven't you seen black people with eyes and you can see their veins? He's like a mad black man. I'm not joking. They'll say that's what the eyes of... But what is the eyes of flame of fire? That's the judgment of Yahweh. The fire is the cleansing, judging element all throughout Scripture in multiple places. So the judging eyes, it's the Jesus who's ready to see and do. This is the purifying, cleansing fire. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze. So some translations will say burnt. And they'll say, well, if something's burnt, what color is it? And people say black. They say, well, if his feet are black, what color is the rest of his body? But again, when you look at the context, it's saying his feet are shining. That's in essence what it means. Even when you look at the Greek, you'll see these. So this is describing, in essence, a glowing man. Do you see what it's saying with everything here? Everything is about fire, light. This is like transfiguration exploded out. The heavenly Jesus. It's not describing his ethnicity. It's describing his glory. This is important to remember. And his voice was like the roar of many waters. If you look up that phraseology in the Old Testament, you'll see it's when God speaks. That's when you have the voice of the roar of the many waters. It's a way to describe God speaking. What do Hebrews like say? And the black man has a deep voice. So it's describing the baritone voice of the black man, the voice of many waters. The passage he's using is not a good place to determine Jesus' his phenotype, meaning the display of his DNA, right? That's not a good place to do it. Because what race has swords coming out of their mouth? His mouth came a sharp two-edged sword. Again, that's judgment. All he has to say is, and it's done. Jesus doesn't do battle fencing people. He speaks, and it's done. And his face was like the sun shining in full strength. Glowing, light, radiant. So we need to know what these say. And see, if it's describing his glory in that way, his majesty, this is describing his deity. The problem is with misusing passages like this is reducing it down to a description of ethnicity, which is a description of deity, ultimately. Because Jesus is described in terms the Old Testament only uses for Yahweh. Nonetheless, that doesn't mean white Jesus portrayals shouldn't be attacked. So here's a list of some of the most well-known artists and painters and paintings. They're the last one's a movie, if you've ever seen that. It kind of has the glowing Jesus. A lot of these, especially the latter ones, are influenced by Italian Renaissance paintings. And this is kind of carried over into the New World, a lot of these. In fact, let me show you some. The ones I'm showing you now are actually from American artists. And here's what's so interesting. Who came over first as far as a heavy dose, as far as their religious affiliation in the Americas? The Puritans. The Puritans were iconoclasts. Does anyone know what an iconoclast is? Well, I'll tell you. When the Reformation happened, if we have time, I'll show you some pictures at the end. When the Reformation happened, Catholics had all these images of Jesus all over, right? Statues and paintings and icons, and so to the East. Whenever the Puritans or the Reformed took over, in essence, a church or a town, they had burning picture parties. Sometimes they're actually kind of even violent. They're called iconoclasts. It means icon smashers. That's what the word means. The belief is called iconoclasm. My point by saying that, the Puritans, they brought negative stuff. They still had, in general, there's exceptions, but in general, ethnic stereotypes about Native Americans and all kinds of, in general, right? They were definitely sinful men, product of their time. But they didn't bring pictures of white Jesus. Later on generations, when Christianity became more diversely represented in the New World, you had people like Moravians and other Christians who didn't have the same qualms, because the Puritans said, this violates the second commandment. Don't make a graven image. Don't make a picture of deity. So they didn't do it. So Reformed churches tend to be bare-walled, maybe a cross, right? Well, so when other Christians came, this is what they started painting. And this is a portrayal of like the people in the New World coming to, it doesn't say white Jesus, but obviously coming to white Jesus, right? The first American painters who began to paint white Jesus paintings, they were not popular in America. They were popular in Europe, because America still was Puritan influenced to where it's like we don't go that way. This is not to say white Jesus never took hold. It does. That's why we're doing this. But I'm trying to give you the real historical background to it. It doesn't mean there wasn't racism. I'm not saying that. I'm just trying to help you understand the full picture, because people will sometimes conflate everything together about American Christianity or Christianity in the New World, and we just want to have a better understanding. So these are some of the other images by American painters in the beginning. And, I said it didn't take hold at first, but it's going to take hold, because I'm going to show you a picture in a little bit here that's probably the most reproduced picture that's ever existed, and it is white Jesus. But not those. Now, why do we need to do this then if that's the case? Well, because, as you're going to see, some people could not get it out of their head that Jesus is white.
When I saw this headline, I kind of laughed, and I thought, this is so ridiculous. Yet another person claiming it's racist to have a white Santa.
She's complaining about people who didn't want a white Santa. But, I mean, most of my black friends in their house had black Santa anyway. This is just something that I guess people didn't know about or something. So she's complaining about it and says something sad but funny in her defense of white Santa.
And by the way, for all you kids watching at home, Santa just is white. But
even that's weird. Santa's based on Nicholas. Nicholas is from the area in the Bible described as Asia Minor. He was I don't see how he would be a white man anyway. Now the Coca-Cola Santa, sure, he's a white man, right? But is that what she's drawing it upon? So yeah, the mainstream portrayal of Santa is white. But I'm saying like the actual real Santa, if you want to go there, that was at the Council of Nicaea most likely, you couldn't have called him a white man either. The real Santa.
Just because it makes you feel uncomfortable.
Here's where it comes.
Doesn't mean it has to change. You know, I mean, Jesus was a white man too, but you know, it's like he was a verifiable fact, as is Santa. I just want the kids watching to know that.
Well, if she knew that, why didn't she know he was from Asia Minor? You know, but Santa, not Jesus. And watch these guys are reacted to it. They're supposed to do a segment. They can't be.
About that. Poor people. Everybody's got to laugh. You know?
All right, so white Jesus, he's got a foothold. That's why we got to do a class to try to break the foothold. And here is the most reproduced picture of all time. Warner Salmon's 1940, white Jesus. I didn't do that, but I don't know what happened. Everyone's seen that, right? That's the sort of the ultimate example. Interestingly enough, I juxtapose it. This is one of the absolute earliest. Now, because it's painted on like I forget if it's a church wall or a cave wall, the skin tone's not really part of it, but these are darker features and in any way wouldn't match this guy. This right here is a composite that some researchers made of Jesus in film. So this is sort of a composite image of all the Jesuses who have ever appeared in film. I mean, he could be an emo rocker or something, you know? Like, that's kind of the way he looks. Now, it's funny, some of this actually comes from a historical forgery. By the way, if you do urban apologetics, you pretty much got to get this book. And a lot of what I've said so far comes out of this, which is an excellently sourced book. So we're going to talk about a medieval falsehood that became basically a fact in a lot of people's minds in the 19th century. It's a fraudulent letter. It's called Publius Lentulus. And it's supposed to be written, supposedly, now it's a falsehood, by someone who was a governor of Judea during Jesus' lifetime to a Roman official. And we know it came about really in the 9th to 14th century, so it's a medieval forgery. There's a lot of medieval forgeries. But listen to the way it describes Jesus, which, notice the Bible never describes the physical appearance of Jesus. So we could say that means the Bible's emphasis is not on Jesus' ethnicity. That's true. We could say it's not important, but then we'd be missing an important apologetic and historical point that white Jesus has been misused. And so since he has, it's become an important apologetic point. So now it is important to discuss it. Do you see what I'm saying? It's become that way by misuse, so now here we are. But the Bible itself, it could have said, for example, Absalom, his hair was thick, it weighed this many shekels. Now, even with Absalom, why did the writer do that? Because later on, his hair, which was his pride, gets caught in a tree. It's relevant to the story. In general, the Greeks were more superficial than the Hebrews in their descriptions of people's physical form. In general, the Bible usually doesn't describe people's physical appearance unless it's relevant to the story. Goliath is super tall. David, usually that's the case. But here's this. He is a man of medium size. He has a venerable aspect, and his beholders can both fear and love him. His hair is of the color of the ripe hazelnut, straight down to the ears, but below the ears, wavy and curled, with a bluish and bright reflection flowing over his shoulders. It is parted in two on the top of his head. Do you see how this is the way white Jesus is portrayed? It's from this fraudulent letter. After the pattern of the Nazarenes, his brow is smooth and very cheerful, with a face without a wrinkle or spot, embellished by a slightly ruddy complexion. His nose and mouth are faultless. His beard is abundant, of the color of his hair, not long, but divided at the chin. His aspect is simple and mature. His eyes are changeable and bright. He is terrible in his reprimands, sweet and amiable in his admonitions, cheerful without loss of gravity. He was never known to laugh. What? That's like Gnosticism really put on top of Jesus really there. I mean, why is Jesus never known to laugh? I mean, this is just fraud all through and through. I mean, if you're hanging out with disciples, you laugh sometimes. This is how dumb they were, right? But often to weep. I don't want to hang out with this guy. This sounds horrible. His stature is straight. His hands and arms are beautiful to behold. His conversation is grave. Debbie Downer, right? Infrequent and modest. He is the most beautiful among the children of men. Bro, relax. I think this is homoerotic. But in all seriousness, that's where from a fraudulent letter is where you get a lot of this. So, there's been people who have actually co-opted and say, look, we have a description of Jesus, and have used this fraudulent letter to prop up the idea of white Jesus. And in fact, I run into Hebrew Israelites who are plenty enough racist, but I also run into the Anglo-Israelites and the Christian identity occasionally because they like to argue with Hebrew Israelites. And just like the Hebrew Israelites make a lot of messed up memes, the Christian identity people make up a lot of messed up memes. And I didn't have to search for this one. This one appeared in a group I run on Facebook. You can't read all these, but like, what? Saving black people since, well, never. That's what white Jesus says, right? Just like the Hebrew Israelites, their Jesus is not saving anyone that's different than them and him. This guy is not saving anyone that's different than them and him. Well, let's talk a little bit about what we can say about Jesus. Basically, that he was an average first century Jew with a beard. Hebrews 7:14 says he was from the tribe of Judah. John 7:10-11 is a passage where they can't find Jesus. Where is he? And so you have a number, the reason I bring that up is you have a number of places where Jesus can't be found in crowds, or he can slip through crowds. If he is sort of this, if he's abnormal among them, then it wouldn't make sense that he could do that. Jesus appeared to be, he looked like an average first century Jew. There's nothing physically distinctive about him. It doesn't appear. Matthew 26, that's where Judas has to betray him with a kiss. He said, remember, I'll let you know by the guy kiss on the cheek. That was the sign and the symbol, right? Isaiah 53:2, though, now we're going to the Old Testament. So these aren't the Gospels, but these are messianic passages that describe in great detail the crucifixion of Jesus, right? And what is Isaiah 53:2? It says, no form or majesty, no beauty, but a man of sorrows. It says no form or majesty in some translations that we should behold him. Meaning, he wasn't anything special to look at. I don't think, like some people say, it necessarily means Jesus is ugly. It doesn't indicate that. It's just saying there's nothing physically impressive about Jesus. What is Isaiah saying there? Is it merely metaphorical? I don't think so. I think when you look and you read Isaiah 53, which is, again, all about Jesus, no form or majesty. So the glowing, kind of levitating slightly off the ground Jesus or anything like that, I think the Bible clearly mitigates against that. A beard, though, because also a messianic passage in Isaiah 56 says, I give my cheeks to those who would pull my beard. So one of the tortures of what they did seemed to be pull his beard. And we do have some coins from around the time of Jesus that portray a Jew on them, and they are men with short cropped beards. So they're a little shorter than is often portrayed in the art, but it doesn't mean Jesus looked like those guys per se, but it's sort of a common way they looked in. And I think these descriptions would match that. Keep on going on with that. Leviticus 19:27 tells the Jews not to round off the hair on their temples or to mar the edges of their beard, right? So Jesus is born under the law, according to Galatians 4:4. So that again is evidence of Jesus having a beard. Now, a lot of the portrayals of Jesus have a beard, but it's just sort of emphasizing what we can and can't know. What about the long hair? Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11:14, does not nature itself teach you that it is shameful for a man to have long hair? Is Paul going to say that if he's got Jesus Christ with the long Jesus Christ superstar hair? Do you see what I'm saying? And it seems like Paul would have some idea. There's no evidence Paul was an eyewitness of Jesus, but some idea of what Jesus looked like. I mean, he is with the disciples. He's there. He knows. This is not an argument he would make. So the long hair Jesus does not seem to match anything. In fact, that's not really even the way of any portrayal of Jews that we have from that time era. They don't look like that. They don't have that sort of kind of effeminate hair that a lot of Jesuses have as far as the portrayals. Now, what about being a Nazirite? Well, the Nazirite vow is given in Numbers 6:1-21. John the Baptist was a Nazirite, right? Because he didn't drink alcohol. Luke 1:15 is the evidence for that. Why is that relevant? Because one of the Nazirite vows is no razor shall touch his head. So that could be a long-haired Jewish man, right? But that means the average Jew, a razor touches his head. Because the symbol of the Nazirite vow is no razor touches your head. So John the Baptist with the long hair makes sense. Not Jesus, though, because also in these passages we have evidence that Jesus drank. Jesus drank wine. He made water into wine. And by the way, it was real wine. The old argument about it was like just grape juice of the era is silly. And in fact, that doesn't make sense, because if that's the case, how could you get drunk off of it? John 2, this is great wine. Usually they bring it out at the end when everyone's drunk. Jesus like, I need grape juice. You can't get drunk off grape juice. What are you talking about? You just got to pee. That's all. You see what I'm saying? It doesn't even make sense logically. Jesus drank because one of the criticisms was he liked to hang out with the hookers and drink, right? Jesus drank. So the point of that is not about Jesus drinking. The point of that is he was not a Nazarite. The long hair does not make sense with the portrayal of Jesus. Physically robust, though. There's lots of evidence for that. Doesn't mean he was like He-Man, but physically robust, I think we can say. Matthew 9:35, it says he walked to all the cities and villages. Jesus is doing a lot of walking. He is walking all over the Galilean region, numerous places. We can calculate the miles and stuff. That's a lot of walking. Jesus was not, a wimp in essence. In fact, once or twice, depending on how you look at these passages, Luke 19:45, John 2, he drove everyone out of the temple with a whip. There was something intimidating or fierce about Jesus making his own whip, then driving everybody out. This is a physically robust Jesus. Matthew 27:33-34, Mark 15:23, he's suffering on the cross, dying. Is a way to kind of mitigate the pain. Sometimes they would say, hey, you want some alcohol? It'll kind of make you feel better. Jesus says no. He's fully experiencing and wants to be fully aware, so he turns it down, right? This is a physically robust, mentally strong man. And in fact, his job. Now, sometimes carpenter can be limiting to us because the tekton word used there for what Jesus did means he could have been involved with shipbuilding and a number of other things, not just kind of making tables and chairs. It could have been sort of a more kind of broader term for what he did there. But a person who works with his hands, a woodworking person who would be calloused and splinters and knew his way around physical. I mean, he was 30. So that means from maybe 12 up to 30, he was working in carpentry the whole time. And in fact, if you go to Rome, there's still a chair Jesus made and you can sit on it. And if you do, it'll cure your bowel diseases. I'm just kidding. Because I teach stuff like that. Not exactly that one, but you'll be regular from then on. But this is a physically robust Jesus. This is good to have some picture of the way Jesus looked. This is a little bit off, but it relates to, what did he wear? We know a mantle, we know sandals, and we know a tunic. We have evidence for that in those passages I listed. I would recommend is a book actually called What Did Jesus Look Like? Joan Taylor did extensive specialized research on this question of Jesus' appearance. And one thing she did was consult experts of the ancient skeletons in Israel. And when we do that, we could then compare those skulls to modern day phenotypes. The skulls of first century Jerusalem, so these are demographically relevant to Jesus Christ. You see what I'm saying? They look the most like the Jews of Iraq today. Now, notice it's Jews of Iraq, not Jews of New York. Let me break that down real quick here. Let me break that down. See, and by the way, one other thing before I tell you about that is, I know it sounds weird, but some experts have done this where you can sort of look at a lot of the almost Nordic depictions of Jesus and say, what would the skull of this person look like? They literally don't match any of the first century skeletons of Judea. Just showing you that how inaccurate most artistic renditions that we see of white Jesus, how inaccurate they are. The skull type wouldn't even match, right? This is not what Jesus looked like. Okay, so there's a diaspora of Jews. So they go all over. And it's interesting, they intermarry a lot of times, and they end up coming out looking somewhat more like the people that they were around. And that's why modern DNA has went in and say, well, okay, how Jewish are they? So first century Jews wouldn't look really identical to a lot of modern Jews because of the intermarriage that's happened in the meantime, especially most of the Jews we come in contact with in America, because we usually come across the Europeanized Jews whose roots go into Eastern Europe. Now, I am not saying they're not Jewish. There's people that make those arguments. I don't think those are valid arguments. And one of the reasons is because when we do DNA and there's modal types. It gets pretty complicated. It's a pretty interesting field. There's certain genetic markers that will match up with Jews in other places from the diaspora, and sometimes it's shocking. For example, there is a group in Africa, South Africa and Zimbabwe, called the Limba, and there's one particular clan of the Limba. They look like their African neighbors, but they had this story that they came from Israel and all this stuff, and no one basically believed them because a lot of people claim to be the lost tribes of Israel. There's a tribe in Afghanistan that claims it. There's Chinese claiming. There's whole books about this. Sometimes people think, oh, actually the lost tribes of Israel have been tried to claim by a lot of people, usually, of course, during times when it's not like a Holocaust, but it's happened a lot. Well, these guys claimed it too. Well, the DNA on these guys prove Semitic markers, especially on the male priestly line, that match Europeanized Jews who look nothing like them. Now, they're both heavily diluted from what we could tell. And especially, it tends to be more prevalent on the men as far as who has more. But my point is, the Zimbabwe people who have Semitic descent, and Woody Allen and Jerry Seinfeld, they don't look at all alike, yet they have distinctive markers that match with both of them. So the modern day Jews from the diaspora, it's not good to think of them as identical to first century Jews. But the Iraqi Jews, who basically never left the area in which Jews are originally from, if you go up and look Iraqi Jews, you're not going to see guys that look like Jerry Seinfeld. But you're also not going to see guys who look like from Zimbabwe. You'll say, it looks like, almost like it makes sense when you see them. And the Iraqi Jews, by the way, which are almost all gone now. The crazy thing is Iraqi Jews were better protected under Saddam Hussein than they are after America left. It's a bizarre thing. It's a whole long story. There's hardly any Jews left in Iraq. But we have old pictures, and a lot of this happened recently. But the skull type and shape most closely looks like the first century Jews we found in Jerusalem. So to look at a general idea, you can say, well, look at the Iraqi Jews. Or to a certain extent, the Jews from Yemen, which there's only about 500 of them left. They have dark features, dark beards, and they don't look like hardly any of the artistic portrayals you've ever seen of Jesus. They don't look the same at all. And that would be in the ballpark of how Jesus would look by all the evidence that we have. They have a lot in common. Now, what's this that I'm going to show you? These are from Egypt, from the 1st century. So middle to upper class people in Egypt during the 1st century, they weren't doing the mummies and all that, but they would have like a funeral box, and on the outside, they would paint a picture of the person. And by the way, these paintings are sort of harrowing, like the way they did the eyes. It's like the dead guy is looking at you. These are 1st century from Egypt. Again, closer in the region. This is a good reference point. And by the way, this would be similar if you look at this and then look at Iraqi Jews. They look so much alike. Let me show you some of these pictures. These are called the Fayum mummy portraits. F-A-Y-U-M. And I actually have a whole book about it. Ancient Faces. Mummy portraits from Roman Egypt. And you can look at that if you'd like afterwards. I mean, that guy almost looks like a little bit like maybe a... He could almost be a cousin of Kanye to me. I don't know. But you see these guys? You see the beard? You see no, that's a lady. So, is that a boy? I forget. Oops, I had these listed. I forget which one that is. But you're getting the idea of these folks. I drew attention to him because some of them have dark features, but it's like 1 out of 10 that are more like that guy. But there's a range, and it's like muddy brown. So again, these are 1st century portraits from Egypt. Much better reference point. But again, do any of these look really like the Europeanized Jesus? No, not at all. This is actually where it's still on it. So this is actually how they would look when they would find it. You can see how the body would fit in there with those. I mean, her hair is almost Afro-like, but at the same time, it'd be dishonest to say that these look like modern Africans, wouldn't it? The world is not black and white. Jim Crow made America think the world is black and white. The world's not black and white. Some of these are repeats, but I wanted to give you different angles of views. Are you guys getting a good idea, though? In 2001, there was a BBC documentary called The Son of God. And they interviewed a forensic anthropologist named Richard Neve. He's a retired medical artist from the University of Manchester. Has a great book, which I actually have here, called Making Faces, which is a pretty good title for a book. And what they did is they took 3 first century skulls from adult males in the vicinity of Jerusalem, rather. And I believe one of them was a model of a Galilean. We found a lot of these. There's 86 skeletons found at Qumran alone, meaning we have an idea. Qumran is the Dead Sea Scroll area. We have an idea of what first century Jews like head shapes would have been like. Doesn't mean we know skin color or texture of hair, right? But when you match it with the first century Egyptians, then we kind of do. Do you see what I'm saying? We actually have a lot of evidence. This is going from the general to the specific, meaning the Bible does not describe how Jesus looked in detail. We can say a lot of ways he did not look, which is what we've done here so far. But then we have to go into other sources, since the Bible doesn't speak on it, to reliable sources to say, okay, can we get some idea? That's what we're doing here. Now, there's a range within the phenotype, as you've seen, right? And so that's why the flesh tones and soft tissue are still speculative. But as I mentioned, those funerary portraits are a good reference. Almost always deep brown eyes, thick dark brown or black hair, honey to olive brown skin, sometimes described as muddy, sometimes ruddy. And that's sort of the basic color palette. Shorter. The average height of these Jewish adult males of all the skeletons we found, 5'1" to 5'5". I like to have Jesus a little bit taller, so I like to say around 5'5". You know, I picture that guy whipping people out of the area a little bit better. You know, they're like, he's tall, he's 5'5". I'm only 5'1", you know. But don't really know. There's Richard Neve, and this is serious work. They take computer models and they put on every skeletal muscle about how it would have been attached. And even though we have these nose holes, you can get an idea of the nose size by the way that, I mean, it's all in this book. It's quite elaborate. This is not casually done. Now, why am I mentioning that? Because he did one for Jesus. Not saying we found the skull of Jesus. We ain't got to find that, amen. But saying by the composites of what we have, here's a first century Jewish man. Now again, the facial expression, bewildered prophet kind of guy. Speculative, I guess, you know, he's seeing the end of the world in this guy. These aren't Christians that are involved with this. But much closer than any portrayal you would have seen of the Jesus paintings. This appeared in an issue of Popular Mechanics. So if you want to read more about this, check out the Popular Mechanics article. And it's just is what it is. So if we say, I want to know what Jesus looked like, I want to know that, here's what we could do. Another video that relates to the icons I brought up earlier. Because what I want to show you guys is that there's actually been a controversy within Christianity a number of times about icons in general. And remember I mentioned the Puritans, when they took over places, what they did was they had burning icon parties. Sometimes they got a little carried away. Those aren't people they're burning. Those are icons, by the way. It's not that Calvinists never killed anybody, unfortunately, but that's not what they're doing in these paintings or portrayals. They're just burning icons. And there's kind of a number of them. Sometimes they would even take down the cross, but most Reformed folks are okay with the cross. But these are the results of Reformation. They considered the iconography to be popery, is what they would refer it. You ever seen the old movie Cromwell, which has got Obi-Wan Kenobi, Alec Guinness portraying Cromwell, who was a reform guy in England at the time? There's a scene where he goes in and he's not even happy there's candles in the front of the church. He didn't want any decoration at all. And in the middle of service, smashes all the candles and stuff. He wasn't playing. But let me show you about the first time there was a controversy with the icons. Because I don't think we should be making images of Jesus in general. I'm not saying it's sin if you don't. I lean that way. First of all, I think you can interpret the second commandment that way. But even if you don't, which I can understand, you see the problem it creates to be using Jesus as propaganda, which is in essence what's happened. But let's look at this the first time, because it's not an old question.
No graven images. That's what God told Moses on the mountain. The God of Israel was too big to fit into a temple, too great to be reduced to a statue. So the Israelites were forbidden to even try to make any image of God. But did anything change when God became flesh? Was an image of Jesus really
By the way, which is a massive big deal from most religions. All religions have some kind of portrayals of their gods. Here's the bull. Aaron did that, remember? They weren't actually saying this is literally God. They're saying this is representation of God. But they would worship sort of through the image or the statue. But see, a bull is kind of like God. He's strong, right? I'm serious. It portrays an aspect of who he is. But he's dumb. He's an animal. He's not made in the image of God. He's not like God. Nothing physical will capture his essence. So God says, don't make physical images. Now, that's what's so interesting about the incarnation. It's almost like, I'm not literally saying this, it's almost as if God broke his own rule, making an image. Jesus Christ is the image of the invisible God. It's quite powerful.
Of God. Early in the church's history, these questions didn't really come up. But in the 4th century, when persecution of Christians ended, paintings of Jesus became more common. And by the middle of the 6th century, religious icons were a regular part of...
That one in the middle is also one of the oldest portrayals of Jesus that we have. The first Christians, we really don't have any. And a lot of the early ones are on old churches or cave walls. And here's what's interesting. When the Christians did start doing this, a lot of it, they would have been in no position to actually know what Jesus would have looked like. But some of it came from them co-opting pagan imagery. Meaning the Christians said, look how Zeus, I don't mean they were trying to make Jesus a pagan god. They would say, look how Zeus is portrayed by their Greco-Roman neighbors. Let's show Jesus is better than Zeus. So they would portray him in the artistic renditions like some of the pagan gods. They weren't saying anything, they were actually, it was a way to subvert Zeus. I'm not saying it was good they did it, but you have to actually read about it. What the people who did that is they were saying Jesus is he's the real God. But so they're portraying him in standard deity. Not all these pictures, but some of the later ones. And this is a good book about that, face-to-face, Portraits of the Divine in Early Christianity. So everything I showed you today are sort of academic books. You'll notice the books that say, we know Jesus looked this way or looked that way, they're never academic books because they're shoddy. The argumentation is shoddy. They don't work. Like, I have a couple here that try to kind of definitively say they're not well argued. The exegesis is bad, the history is bad. They can be, like this one utilizes a different fraudulent passage to say something else about Jesus. So there's bad ways we can go, but the truth is better. So let me keep on with this.
Christian worship in many places, but all that began to change in the early 7th century. Around the year 726, the emperor of the Eastern Empire said icons were no longer part of Christian...
So this is a controversy here in the 8th century. By the way, to show you even that it wasn't such a big problem, what are one of the ways that when the church became more Catholic, it started portraying Jesus and Son, black Madonnas. Now, there's a question about what those meant or didn't mean, but what it means is you had the church, a diverse body, portraying actually Jesus in a variety of ways. Now, what do the folks say who Jesus looks one way or the other? They'll point to the ones that are black or ones that are white and say, well, those are the fraudulent ones. But you can't cast out one and say it's fraudulent and then say this other one from the 900s, that's accurate. About what does a picture from the 900s have to do with anything about Jesus' look? That has nothing. It's just the artist's perception. A lot of times what they would do, hey, you're my model, you sit, they would draw them like the models they had access to. A lot of times.
Worship. And this split Christians into two groups, the iconoclasts and the icon kissers. Now, when the emperor sent his officers to smash an icon of Jesus that towered over a palace door, he learned a valuable lesson. Never underestimate the wrath of a woman who's about to lose her icon. See, a crowd of women attacked the emperor's officers with pots and pans, and then a nun named Theodosia knocked him off his ladder and killed him. Now, she was arrested and sentenced to death by having a ram's horn hammered through her neck, which seems like a rather uncomfortable way to die. And then in the end, it would take another church council to decide whether the church would side with the kissers or with the smashers. In the year 787, Empress Irene of the Eastern Empire gathered more than 300 bishops for the Second Council of Nicaea, the last church council that brought together the Eastern and Western churches. And there they decided this, that images of Jesus, Mary, angels, the saints, okay to hang them in churches and in homes, but only if they were two-dimensional images. Statues were forbidden, and no image was ever to be worshipped. So
the Roman Catholic don't even follow their own council now.
One, and icons continue to be part of the worship in both East and Western churches.
All right. I think I went through, there's one other slide I had I won't be able to get to, but we have a few seconds for questions. I hope this has been educational. I know some people will be like, well, that's not exactly what I was, but to me, this is a way to approach it to give you more information about it. And I think if you talked to somebody and you had this information, you would have more information about the truth, about what we can and can't say than most people who discuss this. And I tried to show you the sources and resources with it as well. And so with that, I think we can be iconoclasts when it comes to white Jesus. And that's why I say adios to white Jesus. Questions?
I was wondering, just in a nutshell, can you kind of say what you think the importance of this conversation is?
So it's become an apologetic conversation because of a few things. There is sort of portrayals of white Jesus have been used for propaganda and to prop up white supremacy. Now, here's the thing, though, and this is where I think we should be careful. That doesn't mean every time someone portrays Jesus those ways, that's what they're doing, though. I think we should make a distinction. But regardless, as a result of the Europeanized Jesus, it has been used in those ways. Secondly, even if that didn't happen, there's a trope now. The trope is white Jesus. This is what you bought into with your Christianity. This is, this was used, for example, to enslave us or to show us that God is white. He doesn't look like us, so you're worshiping someone else. You see what I'm saying? Something like that. So even if that part wasn't true, which it is, you would still have the trope you'd have to deal with and talk about, which is, so there's some truth to the trope of sort of white Jesus being misused. But the alternative answers are almost always wrong when people introduce the trope. Like the Malcolm X clip. He has a valid criticism followed by a wrong response and bad answer based upon bad authority. You see what I'm saying? And misreading of the text. And so what we want to do is we could say, okay, yes, but let's not trade one lie for another lie. What's the truth? But the problem is it doesn't always make people happy to sort of what this is. And it takes longer than simply saying, read Revelation 1:14-15. Jesus black, close the book. We're done for today, right? It's this. Do you see what I had to do here? You know, first century Jewish skulls, phenotypes. You see what I'm saying? But it's important for us to know this to be able to talk with some facility about it. And I think almost every apologetic problem creates great opportunities. Do you see how much we learned about history and art and Bible passages and first century Judaism just from discussing this? Learn all kinds of. So it's important for us. We have some real knowledge about it. So it is an apologetic issue, and it's not going to go away anytime soon, especially as Christianity is changing. So the next Christendom is not in Europe, it's not in America, it's in Africa, Asia, South America. None of those places are dominated by white people. So it's not going to go away. So it'll be good for us to have some facility about it, yeah.
I'm not sure if you care about this at all, or if you know, or if you care, but you know, I heard you mention Iraq, but ancient Babylon that's mentioned in the Bible was actually known now as Iraq.
Yeah.
Does that specification mean anything in context of what you taught today?
Not necessarily. It's just saying, like, when we compare the first century Jews of Israel today, that'd be a complicated statement because you have Ethiopians there, you have Eastern Europe Jews from Russia who are now in Israel. Like, if you actually look at modern Israel, it's not filled with people who, look like Larry David, right? It's filled with a diverse spectrum of people that look so if I said the Jews of Israel, that's almost a meaningless statement because there's no one way they look, right? So if we say the Jews of Iraq, there is a phenotype there, and that matches closely to there. So it just has to do with sort of the way they look. It's demographically relevant, and the skull shapes from what we have there match closely to the way that they look now. And I think also, from what I understand, the Jews from Yemen also as well. And again, if you look at pictures of these, you'll say, okay, this kind of makes sense. They sort of have, I don't know what you want to call it, but a Middle Eastern look. They sort of look somewhat similar to Arabs, not identical, but like you kind of see it. Who else has a great question? Do you got Jesus on your shirt?
No, that's virgin.
Oh, okay. I could say I'd say that's black Jesus with white outlines. It's virgin. Second best. Just kidding.
So Jesus is what?
Jesus is what?
Yeah, black. He's not black.
No. So these passages. So what do we mean by black? If we're going to take the Jim Crow definition of one drop of African blood or something like that, where you could turn Jesus into being black. But generally, what people mean is someone who looks like they're of African descent. That even in itself is problematic because people on the continent of Africa who are from there are not genetically identical. In fact, Africa is the most diverse continent in the world as far as the phenotypes. And if you think about Ethiopian standard features versus standard features of Egyptians, which is Africa, versus standard features of people in sub-Saharan Africa, versus standard features of Kenyans and Somalians, what does it mean to be... So are we talking about skin color? What are we talking about? But see, everything we looked at today, I don't see how that matches Jesus looking that way, because that generally is features of people of African descent, not features of people who hail from what's called the Levant. Sometimes the Middle East, but the Levant is sort of an accurate term for that area of the world. And so if you want to have some idea, those mummy portraits I showed you, that's about as close as we could get. That forensic artist, what he did, that was okay. I don't like the bewildered aspect of the Jesus who's like just woke up or whatever. So we'll put a camera in his face real quick. But that's going to be much, much closer to any painting that you've seen.
I don't do painting dinner like that.
Yeah, exactly. To Jim Caviezel, to whoever. But see, these are the passages a lot of times folks argue Jesus is black. We don't have time to get into these. Because I wanted to say adios to white Jesus. Today I wasn't trying to say adios to black Jesus. But nonetheless, just because he's not European or Nordic, it doesn't mean he looks like someone of African descent either. And it just doesn't make sense. Now, some people will say, well, the continental plate, part of it of Africa, is shared in Israel. And part of the continental plate is, but that's a weird way to make Jesus African. It doesn't change. It wouldn't change his features anyway. But these are some of the passages they use. For example, they'll go to Hebrews 7. Say, oh, look, Jesus from the line of Judah. And they'll say, oh, well, how do people from Judah look? They'll say, oh, Judah mourneth, and the gates thereof languish. They are black into the ground. If you're from Judah, you're black. But if you read the passage, it's saying it has to do with them doing sackcloth and ashes in a state of mourning. It's not about the color of their skin. Because if we're going to do that, there's other places where we've got Israelites that would look white. For example, do you know Laban? Remember Uncle Laban, who gave the guy the wrong wife the first time? It was like, oops, worked another 7 years and gave him the right wife. Remember all that? Laban means white in Hebrew. Does that mean Laban was white? No, of course not. Why would it mean that? Like, I know black dudes with the last name of White. That isn't, you know what I'm saying, right? Don't we? And don't you know white guys with the last name Black? Hello, Mr. Black. But it doesn't mean anything to do with it. So what I'm saying is you can make bad arguments to turn Hebrews white if you want to use these kind of arguments to turn. There's places where it says about ivory skin and things like that, but it's a description of something else. And if you look at all these, a lot of them have to do with lament and other things. For example, here, this is an interesting one too. If you look at that, first of all, this is the woman who may have been black, but even if that's the case, another place says, I'm dark because I've been out in the sun. Now, some people will say, well, black people tan too, but see, you can't use these to turn Jesus black. I'll give you another example. They'll say, well, look, the disciples were black. Look, Simeon, who is called Niger, which is a Latin word for black. But see, if you go through Acts 13, which is a description of the early church, why is Simeon called Niger? Everyone's not called Niger. It's a distinguishing feature, clearly. If they were all black, they all would have been Niger. It wouldn't make sense to say Simeon who was called Niger if they were all black. You see what I'm saying? And you can even look at the names and it lets you know it's highly unlikely. Because there's a list of people, and it shows you actually how diverse the early church was. So one guy was from Cyrene, which is in North Africa, so he may have been black as well. But again, see, even that's problematic, because just because you're from a certain part of the world doesn't automatically mean you look a certain way, right? If I say, oh, he looked like an American, what does that mean? I don't know, fat maybe? I don't know, what does it mean, right? What does it mean to look like an American? It's a joke, guys. I'm saying because there's no one way. Now, other parts of the world are less diverse, so if you said he looks like he's from China, that might have some resonance. But even phenotypes there aren't all the same. So the passages that people argue, which we couldn't really get into today, decide to say people, Christians, like all the Jews were black, are also problematic. And they really don't match historical records. For example, the Egyptians love to show themselves kicking people's butts, so did the Assyrians. And sometimes they portray peoples who were different. And so the Egyptians, you got these paintings, these hieroglyphs and stuff, where they'll show themselves, and they'll show them with people from the kingdom of Nubia or Cushites. They look different. The Cushites look more like what you consider phenotypically today, someone from the African descent, although Egypt is also Africa, but they look different. All you got to do is look at these pictures. They look phenotypically different. Even sometimes when they're colored somewhat differently. So there's a difference between the Egyptians and some from the kingdom of Nubia. And they're both on the continent of Africa. And sometimes we have ancient portrayals of Hebrews, and they're also somewhat different. They don't look the same as the way the Nubians are portrayed. So just like it's bad to make Jesus white, it's also not accurate to make him black. If you say darker features, the problem is people then explain the definition of black to be almost anything non-white, but I don't know if that makes sense. So it's like, what are we talking about here? Do we mean? And so Jesus most likely looked like a lot of the other first century Jews that we looked at, and I have no other reason to think otherwise. But again, what's interesting, when Jesus is described, it's about his glory, his majesty, his power, and the Bible could have easily described his phenotypical features. Why not? They know how to write. It wasn't a relevant issue. Now it's become an apologetic issue, so we've got to deal with it. But just because he wasn't one way doesn't mean he was one the other way. All right, well, it looks like we got to end. Last question.
There were any physical descriptions of Jesus in the books that weren't included at the Council of Nicaea?
So Nicaea is not where the canon was decided, but I know what you're saying. You're saying other books that claim to be gospels that were not ended up in the canon for whatever reason, mainly because they were written after the first century, so they could not have been written by eyewitnesses. But those books, they describe Jesus in much stranger ways because they're Gnostic influenced. So here's what I mean by that. There's one passage in one of the Gnostic Gospels, which are not really Gospels at all. It says sometimes when the disciples looked at him, he looked like a woman. Other times like a young boy. Other times like a middle-aged man. It's showing Jesus is not even bound by physical limitations. And it's because of the Gnosticism, which says physicality is bad. They have a Jesus who is essentially able to morph into different shapes or types. So so he's described in some way physically, but it's irrelevant to the historical Jesus about what he would look like. There's nothing about that would be like a clue to like, oh, he looked this way. The first thing we have that I know as far as something written is this fraudulent passage I read. And there's one guy who thinks he can reconstruct a passage of Josephus to perhaps get a black Jesus, but it doesn't seem right, and it wouldn't really match anything else we've seen portrayed. Robert Eisler is his name. He's from the 30s now. But so we just don't have it. We have to argue from the general to the specific, if we're going to be honest with the data, in my view. But the point of I want to reemphasize, Jesus was not white like the paintings. It's impossible that he looked those ways, right? But that doesn't mean that we can say we know for sure what he looked like or that Jesus was black. It doesn't equal that. It just equals he did not look like those paintings. And that's why we can say with all firmness, adios to white Jesus. And now we got to say vamonos to our class.
Great image.